Thanks for taking part in this brief Bible dive with Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and with me, Pastor Nick. If you want to hear more about our congregation, go to our website, biblesdoesn'tsay.org. And of course, we'd love for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, select to receive notifications, share this video, like this video. It's great to get our message out of what we're trying to do here. These are brief Bible dives, are brief 10 to 15 minute times when we never try to cover an entire Bible story, but try to get a little snippet of it and take a deep but brief dive under the surface and bring up some precious pearls. Today we're talking about Genesis chapter 30, verses 37 through 43. And we'll start with the question to consider and then dive into a bunch of background. And then actually near the end, we're going to hear the Bible story. Now, that's a little bit out of the normal order, but the background leading up to the story is just as important as what happens after it. So the question to consider is this. When has God worked through me, meaning you? When has God worked through me despite my foolishness? When has God worked through me despite my foolishness? And to be clear, and to be totally straightforward, we've all been foolish. I've been foolish more times than I probably want to count. But when has God worked through me despite my foolishness? And then here's some background on this story. Many years previous to the story taking place, Jacob fled to his uncle Laban's house because Jacob had tricked his brother Esau out of their father's blessing. Now, Esau and Jacob were twins, but Jacob was born second. Esau was the first one to be born just moments before, and so Esau should have inherited this special blessing from their father Isaac based on the tradition at the time. Esau and Jacob were grandsons of Abraham. And perhaps you'll recall the scriptural phrase, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it was a family line type of thing. So after tricking their blind father into giving him the blessing, Jacob fled to another country where his uncle Laban lived. Now Laban had two daughters, Leah and Rachel. And Jacob fell in love with Rachel and wanted to marry her. And yes, this was his cousin, but I guess, I don't know, there were slim pickings back then or something, but we'll just kind of go over that, pass over that now, because that's a whole different topic, right? So in order to marry Rachel, Laban said that Jacob would have to work for him for 7 years, and Jacob agreed. After all, he wasn't planning to return home to his brother Esau anytime soon. Well, after they got married, after the marriage happened, the wedding, Jacob removed the veil, and lo and behold, Laban had tricked him. Jacob wound up marrying Leah, not Rachel. Jacob had deceived his brother Esau previously, and now he himself, the deceiver, was the recipient of his uncle's deception. This character flaw seems apparently to have run a little bit in the family. What this meant is that Jacob needed to work another 7 years, so a total of 14, for free for Laban because he wanted to marry Rachel, the one he really loved. Now, during this entire time, Laban prospered tremendously since God was blessing the work of Jacob. And, God had a plan for Jacob despite Jacob's character flaws, despite his deceptive behavior. Well, after 20 years, Jacob decided that it was time to return to his homeland, Canaan, where his brother Esau still lived. And by this point, many of his children had been born. So in Genesis 30, 25 through 26, we hear the following. When Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away, that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wife and my children, my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know very well the service I have given you." In response to this request, Laban did everything he could to convince Jacob to stay. I mean, he knew that Jacob was basically a cash cow for him. And it doesn't sound like Laban was actually all that concerned about his daughters or grandchildren either. No, he was concerned about his own prosperity. I mean, it's sad to note, but we remember that daughters and women in general were often viewed as property in that time and place. So here's Laban doing that again, viewing his children more as property, caring about his wealth. So he offered Jacob a lot, but Jacob wanted none of it. He had lived in the household of his deceptive uncle and now father-in-law for decades, and, simply put, it was just time to go home. However, he did need a means to provide for his burgeoning family. We'll know that Jacob's name is renamed by God to Israel, and his children become, the 12 tribes of Israel. There's more children than 12, but beyond that. So that's when that's when he makes this following deal with Laban, a deal that scientifically makes no sense at all. But does remind us that despite our own human foolishness, God's plans for us can still come to fruition. So here it is. It's recorded in Genesis 30 verses 37 through 43. The story says the following. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the rods. He set the rods that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the rods, and so the flocks produced young that were striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and the completely black animals in the flock of Laban. And he put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob laid the rods in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the rods. But for the feebler of the flock, he did not lay them there. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man grew exceedingly rich, and had large flocks, and male and female slaves, and camels and donkeys. See, what happened is they made this deal, and Jacob said to Laban, okay, I'll take all the speckled, spotted, and so on ones, the ones that are really, really rare. And Laban was just ecstatic with this, because he thought, well, he's not going to get that much at all, and I'm going to keep most of this. But now we have here where, this bizarre Bible story of him putting different colored things in front of animals so that they would breed in certain ways. Now we do not have to do mental gymnastics in order to try to understand how Jacob could possibly pull off what he did. I mean, yes, there was a superstition at the time that, whatever something was looking at while it was breeding, it would begin to resemble it. Obviously, we know that that's just not the reality. But we don't have to park our brains at the door to understand how Jacob could have used a superstitious practice to deceive his deceptive uncle. It was, after all, a Christian monk by the name of Gregor Mendel, who is the father of genetics. It was a Christian monk, Gregor Mendel, a man of deep faith, who used his pea plant experiments to learn and share how traits can be passed from one generation to the next. So faith and science are not enemies, and getting wrapped up in that would really miss the point of what's going on here. See, the point of the story is not that this is how to get animals to reproduce with certain traits. The point of the story is that God's plan was going to happen no matter what. No matter what. God's plan was going to come to fruition, even though two tricksters were duking it out with one another in less than ethical ways. So that brings us back to the question for this brief Bible dive. When has God worked through me despite my foolishness? I mean, we've all acted foolishly from time to time, and yet here we are. I know that I've done some dumb things in my life, and I thank God that I've learned through those faults and failures and fumbles. Just as I thank God that others can learn from theirs too. So God doesn't wait. God doesn't wait for us to be perfect to work through us. This side of heaven, no one's perfect with the exception of Jesus Christ himself. Still, God has a plan, and God will work through us to make that plan become a reality. So the next time you maybe find yourself getting down on yourself for a foolish decision or a foolish thought or whatever, remember that somebody like Jacob, one of our forebears in the faith, the one who would take on the name Israel, remember that God could work through him. And just like us, remember that God works through us not just despite our imperfections, but may actually leverage those imperfections to make this a better world. So thanks again for joining with Beautiful Savior in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and with me, Pastor Nick, for this brief Bible dive. To learn more about our congregation, our website is bslcmi.org. And yeah, if you could like this video and share it with somebody that you think might find it helpful, we'd really appreciate that. Now, go out and love God, and love your neighbors.